China is claiming unreasonable maritime sovereignty. Against that, US is operating freedom of navigation operation. They are being done in the Indo-Pacific. Why does all the matter comes to the Indo-Pacific? It's about Indo-Pacific. Main actors on Pacific are US, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and some of Asian member states. Recently, we included India into the Pacific players. We call it Indo-Pacific. Before 15th century, era of navigation, Pacific was not well known to Europe. European ships reached to Malacca through Straits of Malacca. At first, it was all for establishment of consuming market. East India companies founded in Amsterdam in 1600 and in 1602 they merged to against Spain. Dutch East India Company settled its hub on Jakarta and monopolized a trade with Japan. Britain also founded East India Company in 1600. Britain tried to take its share in India. The very battlefield was the Strait of Malacca. To link to Europe and Asia, three factors should be met. First, sophisticated navigating skill and financial support. They are inseparable. Improving navigating skill demands experience and investment, and it directly demands financial support. Therefore, from the Magellan who named the Pacific, all the voyage was supported by the state. Second, Suez Canal. Before 1869, the opening of the Suez Canal, European traders should navigate further away through Cape Agulhas. Even they moved their trade goods by land. Considering there was no Suez Canal in 16th century, the third factor was more important. Third, Strait of Malacca. It shows the trade path. To take the power on there, Britain and Netherlands fought under the name of East India Company. As we know, victory of the fight made Britain as the Great Britain and the second the empire on which the sun never set. In 19th century, Pacific became the battlefield of Britain and Russia. After the Crimean War in 1853, Russia tried to expand their way to Asia. They reached to Joseon. Against that, Britain occupied Gomondor illegally. But they settled the negotiation before it became too hot. It doesn't mean Russia could be the hegemony of Pacific. Imperial Japan tried to expand their colony to Korean Peninsula. In 1904, Russo-Japanese War broke out. All European states predicted the victory of Russia. However, US and Britain supported Japan. The secret of Japanese victory is not just support of US and Britain, but also the occupation of Pacific. Japan occupied the shortcut before Russian fleet shifted. They assaulted the Russian fleet in 8 February 1904. Yet the declaration of the war was done in 10th February. Due to this, Russian Baltic fleet had to travel a long way. They tried to support the battle in East Asia through the way of Cape of Hope. On 9th January 1905, on their way to the battlefield, they were informed the annihilation of Russian fleet. Eventually, on 5th September 1905, Treaty of Portsmouth was signed by the arrangement of Theodore Roosevelt. For this, Japan took the part of hegemony in the East Asia and Pacific. From the victory of Russo-Japanese War, Japan expanded their influence on Asia and Pacific. The First World War let Japan expand their influence more. Britain needed to keep Russia in check, so they agreed on the expansion of Japan in Asia. In 1933, Manchurian Incident occurred. It triggered the collapse of Japanese hegemony on Pacific. Expansion of Japan finally reached to territories of Soviet Union, France, Netherlands, and US. To acquire natural resources, Japan reached to Indonesia, Indochina, Taiwan, and Philippines. Because of their overstretch, US practiced sanctions on Japan. On 7 December 1941, Japan assaulted on Pearl Harbor without any declaration of war. Attack on Pearl Harbor destroyed 8 US battleships, 188 flights, and victimized 2,403 US civilians. On 8 December 1941, US officially declared the war against Japan. It was also one of the German strategy. Germany had the strategy of continental priority, while Japan had the strategy of maritime priority. Let's deal with it later. Doolittle Raid and Battle of Midway changes the situation. Through several battles including Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, on 15th August 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. After the Second World War, the hegemony of Pacific shifted into US and USSR. On 25th June 1950, Korean War broke out. It's the war designed by Soviet Union. First 2.5 months, North Korean soldiers swept the peninsula. On 15 September 1950, UN Collective Army practiced Operation of Chromite in Incheon. Against the UN Army, China decided to intervene in the war on 19 October 1950. This war was not just Korean Civil War, but also hegemonic war and ideologic war. On 27th July 1953, the war ended with the Korean Armistice Agreement. It was the first war democracy and communism fought against each other. This also separated the Pacific into two parts, Democratic Alliance and Communist Alliance. After the Korean War, there came the proxy warfare era. Especially in Vietnam 1964, as an excuse of Gulf of Tonkin incident, US intervened in the Vietnam Civil War in earnest. This let some Asian states become new parts of Pacific hegemony. Vietnam War weakened the power of the US. Eventually, President Nixon made his doctrine. The very point of doctrine is accepting the weakening of US power. Also, Soviet Union needed help of US for food aid. US did not lose its guard against USSR. In 1972, Nixon's conversation with Mao, also known as Ping-Pong diplomacy, persuaded China to stand against USSR. Then, Nixon could not expect the growth of China we are facing now. America's weakness also gave the chance to Japan and Germany. Trade balance lost its balance. Growth of them made the US trade deficit had accumulated. On 22nd September 1985, US had to admit their growth and make Plaza Accord. Because of the Vietnam War, US hegemony on Pacific was split up. Now there are 4 actors on Pacific: US, USSR, China, and Japan. In late 1980s, US could expect the victory of the Cold War. At the same time, in Asia, 4 tigers emerged: South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. From 1970s, Dadong set down the hurdle between democracy and communism. 4 tigers could get support from both sides and became newly industrialized countries. This made the Pacific as the center of trade again. After the Cold War, US shifted their focus on Mid-Asia. In 2001, US initiated the war against Afghanistan, and in 2003, Iraq. Thanks to the shift, China could strengthen their power on the Pacific. After the 2 Mid-Asia wars, US practiced low interest rate policy. It increased incredible loans. Eventually, in 2008, subprime mortgage crisis broke out. This crisis let China take a big part in Pacific hegemony competition. In 2008, GDP growth of China was up to 9%, while that of US was minus. This made Obama pivot to Asia. On Pacific, US and China are competing. China is claiming A2AD, US is claiming freedom of navigation. From the era of navigation, occupation of Pacific has meant the global hegemony. Spain, Netherlands, Britain, and US, they all became the hegemonic state by controlling Pacific trade through the Strait of Malacca. Alfred Mahan insisted maritime power is the key to be hegemonic state in his book, and Paul Kennedy insisted overstretch weakens the hegemony in his book. US overstretched its power to Mid-Asia, where it's much less important than Pacific, while China fully focused on Pacific. The history of Pacific shows us losing Pacific means losing hegemony. Is US losing its hegemony on Pacific? Next time, let's think about rising of China in Pacific.